my bachelor, where people start saying, your work looks like a Francis Bacon. And I never really looked at him as an artist for that reason. But then I started exploring a bit more, and yes, there are some elements of his work maybe in the way how I explore the painting. So to give you a little bit of a context of what happened to my life in the last 4 months, I got to have that opportunity to work here in this gallery at the back room, which is, as you saw, it's a very small space. And that space became something very different from what I'm used to because of the size of the space. So first time when I walked into the space, I thought about the space as a white cube, and immediately I thought that working in oils, which is a primary medium for me, and the size of the paintings like you see here is not going to work in the space. So I had to think about switching the medium and switching the tools in order to achieve something that will be a little bit more applicable to the space that I have. So the oils still might have been a possibility if I would focus on much smaller scale, but I wanted to be free with what I'm doing in the studio. So I decided to switch the medium to acrylics, but that didn't work. And then I thought of bringing Sumi Ink to the painting and exploring that on the surface as a primary medium to work with. And Sumi is something that I've been working in the past, but not extensively. Like in the last 3 months, I just focused only on the Sumi Ink. So that was something different for me. And my wife, who is also an artist, she also works in Sumi Ink, and that's her primary medium for the last 3-4 years. And so I thought that connecting to her knowledge about Sumi allows me to explore the painting in a different way that I do. So my painting, I think about my painting as a combination of abstraction and figuration, and look at it as a perfect marriage where neither abstraction or figuration take over in the painting. So it's like a combination and mismatch of those two, depends on the individual artwork that I do in the studio. So that's the, I know that you can't really see very well, but that's the small studio that I've been working. And to give you a little bit of a context of where I come from, I was born in Poland, to be precise, exactly in the middle of Poland, which is somewhere here. And the city is called Łódź. And I was in between countryside and a big city during my time in Poland, especially during my early stage of my life, something between like 4 and 10. I think that was really the time when countryside shaped my thinking about the work. And then suddenly we moved to the city where that pace of the life changed everything that I knew about the life itself. So that was a big change for me during that time. And the city that I moved to was called Promised Land, which in Polish is Ziemia Obiecana. And that means basically that during the 1800s and at the beginning of the 20th century, city was really booming in industry, all kinds of industries. And a specific one was the wool. And we were the biggest importer and exporter of wool during that time in Europe. And people were coming to that city because they knew that they can create business there, they can have a work, they can have life there. So they called it a promised land. And here's the picture of 3 entrepreneurs that came to Łódź in 1800s. And the motto was, I don't have anything, you don't have anything, let's build the factory. So that's what they did. They basically had no support, but they had that dream. So oftentimes which is referred to that Hollywood dream as well, because in early 50s, it became the city where they built huge studios, huge factory studios for the movie industry. So the movie production was really huge there until 80s. And then it collapsed during all kinds of economical changes. And that also led me to a little bit of my life. I went to a high school that was focused only on drawing and painting in very traditional way. So it was focused on traditional thinking about how we pursue the 3D dimension in the drawing or painting. And that was really good base for me to explore later on in my life. But right after I graduated from that high school, I was lucky to be hired by a local movie studio that was producing movies, stop motion movies. And at that time, to make the story short, I got into short movie production, Ichthys by Mark Skrebetsky, that got international attention, that led to another production of Peter and the Wolf that was brought from England to Łódź, and that movie got an Oscar prize. So I thought at that time, when I was working on that production, that I'm going to stay in that industry. That the thinking about doing painting or sculpture was something too abstract for me. So I thought that that kind of niche of industry is for me, and I felt really good at it. But at the same time, I realized that this type of industry comes and goes with the projects that appear. So I can be on the production for a year, but then I have another 6 months without project or job. And that kind of scared me a little bit. I felt like if I'm going to be in that kind of phases, it's maybe better to pursue something different, and in that case was a painting. And I didn't want to do the painting in Poland. I didn't want to go to the academy. It was coming back again to childhood, when I thought about myself as living somewhere outside of Polish borders. And I think that at that time, in my early 20s, I thought that England might be a good choice, because European Union opened all the borders so we can travel freely, and I thought learning English might be much easier than maybe pursuing Spanish or German. So I kind of thought about that relation in terms of language as well. So I moved to the UK in about 2008, when I pursued my BA, Bachelor and Master's in painting. It was a studio-based study, both for Bachelor and Master's. And the uniqueness about the Manchester School of Art was the way they conducted thinking about painting. So Manchester School of Art is really about conceptual painting. It's not much about learning how to paint or how to build your skills in drawing or painting in a traditional way. So I felt like that was a perfect match for me, because I already brought the background I had from my high school. And just with the twists of academical thinking as well as exploration and experimentation with painting, allow me to focus on something in between figuration, abstraction, and match that with all kinds of concepts that I was exploring during that time. So that was that kind of thinking behind it. And then going back slowly to the process of the residency where I am at right now. When I came here, in the first place, beside the limitation of the space that I felt like actually is not a limitation, but just the exploration of me as an artist in a better and bigger way, I thought about it that I need some type of system in place in order to explore that painting. I'm going to play something for you. It's 3 minutes long. You can find it on YouTube as well. But I thought about it that it's very interesting. It's about system operating procedure. So as you may know, like bigger companies, whether they are exploring manufacturing or agencies, they have some sort of procedures in place, meaning that they don't do things randomly. The more specific they are in those procedures, the faster they can progress with growing the business. And I kind of found that similar in terms of art. I think that I never thought about it that way, but actually those systems unconsciously exist in my practice as well. So it doesn't apply directly into the painting, but in indirect thinking about it. I thought that I have the same similar procedures in the studio. I just don't think about them because obviously they became so natural to me that I'm not thinking about breaking them down into the small steps or processes, because that already with me, with that practice that I gained in the last 10 years or more. But then more closer I start thinking about it, more closer I realize that actually maybe stepping back and breaking those things into the smaller steps maybe will allow me to see something in the work that I haven't seen previously, and then leverage that into different experience with the painting that I have in the last year, or even just a couple of weeks even before the residency. So obviously I had that limitation of the space, so I thought that painting on the wall is something that I always do, but maybe switching things a little bit in a different way. So I decided to move on and then introduce a mop in the painting. So mop is a very not really welcome or like a nice tool to work with. It's something almost that when we think about the mop, it's just something that probably something you don't want to do, touch, think about, or reminds you, or cleaning that you need to do at home. So that's like a secondary thing that you can think about this as a tool. But if you switch the meaning of it and then bring it up to something a little bit different, it could be a natural way of introducing new mark making or new brush strokes in their work that will be unique and different from everything else that you see around. And also, that's a one part of thinking. And oftentimes as an artist, I think of myself as somebody closed in the four walls with my thoughts, frustration, anger, love, whatever emotions I have, and put that onto the paper. But then at the same time, we have that outside world with social media, with all kinds of marketing that comes with it in forms of promoting the work outside of your studio. So recording it and then placing it online for people to judge. So one of the things that people might come across is just like, is using mop, everyone can do that. And that's so true, everyone can do that. But at the same time, the key for me was the tool, not what I can do or not with that. So at the end, I decided to start with the painting on the floor instead of on the wall, and then make that movement of the brush and brush strokes on the floor, where everything changes in terms of the traditional way of thinking about painting. When we think about painting or art in general, we're thinking about that two-dimensional surface that is hung on the wall or on the easel with the small, wider brushes where we make an experiment. But how about forgetting for a moment about those small elements like brushes and maybe other tools that we use on the surface, and then bring that on the floor and use something that is uncommon. In my case, it was a large mop, which allows me to have full movement with my arms and then full movement with the body, and then perform that mark, let it dry, and then move it back to the wall. It comes back a little bit also to traditional Chinese and Japanese painting in Sumi, where they kind of sit in that small closed room with rice paper on the floor. They have those all instances, they meditate, and then they get up, they pick up this big brush, and then they dance around with that, make that mark, and then they leave it as a complete piece of art. And I thought about it the same way, that it's applied in the same manner, but with a different emotion and different tool. So it's a little bit more primitive thinking about the painting, and then trying to make something out of it. So that was the starting point for every single piece that I did during that time in the studio. I know that you can't really see that well on the slides, but that's how it basically started. So to me, sometimes it was only one splash, or two, maybe three, depends on the results I wanted to get. And I also had different types of Sumi Ink. One is a little bit darker in the, and richer in the consistency, and the other one is colder in temperature, so allows me combine those two elements in the work as well, and that brings interesting results. And here you can see one of those moments where I perform something. As you can see, basically it's a splash on the surface. So it's nothing superficial about it. It's just something very simple. Just as much as you would be just picking water from the bucket and applying it on the floor. I think it's the same kind of thinking about the process. But then, and that allowed me to start thinking in more traditional way about the work. So I decided to incorporate portrait into the pieces, just because we have the tendency to see faces in anything, and I think that that's like an easier answer to it, rather than trying to maybe build something different. And saying that, it's not that I don't want to explore anything else, it just was at that moment for me easier to understand what I'm doing and then focus on those faces. So for each face that you see on the work, it's basically one or two reference photos that I found online. And to be more specific, I looked into Black American models with very sharp and slim edges on the face, hair, and I think that became the motive for the painting itself. So the way I look at the painting was that I basically look at that mark or brush stroke that I achieved or got from the surface, and then with the brush or smaller brush, I start trying to see a face in it, and then start incorporating that face into the painting itself. And that became a little bit more of the exploration as well of itself. And the mark making that I did with the mob was transparent enough that on the surface that I had on the wall, allowed me to bring black ridge and then combine those layers together to create something more unique and then more fluid. And that's where that combination of abstraction and figuration came together into the painting. So it was a perfect way for me to think about the painting itself. And that takes me back again to those this video that we saw earlier, that at the end, I'm trying to think about it as a procedure completing every day in the studio, by just breaking it down into those small elements that I did and see how can I explore that in a shorter way and maybe leverage that to a different mode of work, different size, or different elements in the painting. So it could be a full figure, And I'll show you in a second. Toward the end of the residency, I started exploring half of the figure with the hands, just because I felt like I'm exhausting myself with the portrait. I still needed some type of accuracy in it in order for viewer to read it as a combination of abstraction and figuration together. And it takes me back again to that phrase I said earlier that to me the abstraction and figuration is like a perfect marriage where neither of those things takes over, and then they come together in a form of an argument where they create that beauty around. So I think that that's something that I really started liking about ink a little bit more. And toward the end of the residency, I thought maybe applying the same method in oil paintings will work. So I started exploring oil painting, or like one singular color on the paper in oils with that Mark performer as well. However, it's a different medium and it doesn't have that fluid in it like ink itself. So it's a little bit different treatment of the surface. And that again takes me back to this video that we watched earlier, that at the end I have already that instruction with me that I did with the Sumi Ink, but it doesn't really apply necessarily the same way to oils. So I have to reconfigure that and rethink in a different maybe scale, maybe a different way of approaching the paper. Maybe it has to be canvas itself rather than just the paper. So those are the things that I now trying to take to the consideration. And for those of you who saw the space at the back of the gallery, that space also reminds me of Francis Bacon. A lot of people refer my work to Francis Bacon, Gerhard Richter, Wilhelm Sasnow, or Luc Tuymans, but specifically people can see Francis Bacon in it, and that never became to me obvious until I really start looking into Francis Bacon himself. And that was shortly after this, my bachelor, where people start saying your work looks like a Francis Bacon. And I never really looked at him as an artist for that reason. But then I started exploring a bit more, and yes, there are some elements of his work maybe in the way how I explore the painting. But at the same time, I would also look at the artists from their life perspective. So Francis Bacon had a really complicated life, and I think you can maybe dig into that by yourself. But he had those two stigmas where his apartment was hyper clean with very sharp edges, everything was very neat, and then at the same time his studio was extremely messy to the point that when you open the door you can only see the easel and the painting on it and all that mess behind. So there are two theories about his studio and his apartment. One is that he was really that way, and the second one is that actually he never used that apartment and he never used that studio. It was only the selling point for him to introduce work to the audience. And I think that I go with that second explanation more than with the first one, even if his life was very complicated and sophisticated in a lot of ways. And it's not only one sentence that I can explain that. It's something that you probably have to look into more yourself. But the point is that he was bringing people to this studio, showing them the work, showing them whatever is behind that studio. So he was selling that romantic idea of artist studio, where you come in, the paint is all over the floor, you can't really access the space, and then all you see is that painting with the dark space behind it. So really pops in the painting in the first look. And then even if you watch his interviews, you can see that at some point that story he sells doesn't really match with what artists do in the studio, because it's just not there. that physicality of using the space is not there. And then I started thinking about the studio that I was using for the residency in the same way. It became that white cube where people come in and they don't necessarily see me working in it, but they see it as an installation of itself. That became that space where we all know artists work, but at the same time, we will see artists being there, spending the time doing things. It's almost like selling the false dream about the artist and art. And that's what I actually liked about this space the most. It became the installation and project of itself during that time. And at the end, I enjoyed producing the work there, and that became my main goal for it. But at the same time, I'm thinking now about all those things and procedures that follow up after, not only during, but after the residency. And I hope that was kind of a great culmination of my art practice as well, where I apply all the knowledge I have, all the experience, and explore that in a different way than usual. And I think that I'm going to stop here. And if you have some questions, I'll be happy to answer it. And yes, you can ask me whatever you want. Just one more notice, the paintings you see there on the acid paper, it's a cold press paper, which stands for like a high quality paper that doesn't absorb water as quickly as other papers that are produced with other chemicals. And acid-free means that it usually lasts for a long time. Just like Sumi itself has that long life lasting quality. And I think if I would explore that on a different paper, maybe it wouldn't have that quality, but also it has at the same time that fragile element to it. Paper is very fragile to begin with if you don't take care of it in a proper way. So I think that those elements line up together with the space, with the mold, with the treatment of the surface, and that comes together as that one story that line up into artist's practice. Paintings are 30 inches by 22, right? Yes.
What is the book? Is it just experiments?
Yes, so the book itself became a connection for all the work that I had here in the space itself. So after the residency, after that small cube that I had, suddenly I had all this open space here, and then all other open spaces with the work itself. And then when I hung the work, I felt like there might be maybe a little missing element of the process itself. So I decided to use that book, or sketchbook we can call it, that became like a testing ground for the ink itself before I actually apply it to the main surface of the painting with the mop on the floor. And just to make sure that I have enough ink in the water, with the water that is mixed in the bucket. If you go back to the space again, you will see I have two big buckets with the mop sink in the ink. And there are two different types of ink, but at the same time, ink comes already as that consistent liquid that has a rich blackness in it. But I don't need that rich black straight away on the surface. I need something in between that will allow me to rework later and then apply details with the brush and black ink later on the surface. So that's something that I'm kind of keep in mind. And that book became this tester for the ink itself, where I just literally splash with that mop again, just wait a couple of minutes just to see if that consistency of the ink is good, and then switch that back to the main surface. So it became, at the end, a connection between those elements and the reason to ask why it's here. as of itself, maybe it can be artwork of itself, maybe not. To me, it's more of a recollection of what I did in the studio.
Is this a medium you want to keep working with, or what are your future directions?
I think I want to stick to oils. That's like a primary medium that I want to work in. But I'm also thinking about maybe start combining ink and oil at some point and see how that will play out. So there is a lot of things that I can play and explore in the painting again. So probably for now, I will just call it as a period of my life where I explore the ink and Sumi on the paper and then move on back to the oils.
Why did you choose now?
It's a good question. So in my oil paintings, I usually start bringing different types of tools other than brushes. And it could be a cardboard, scraper, squeegee, plastic wrap, anything that brings a different element in the painting other than just the brush itself. And then when I moved to the, and I also use the cloth, so like throwing cloth into the surface of the painting, but that doesn't really reflect well on the paper with the ink. So I tried cloth at the very beginning and see if I can just make some patches, but it didn't have the same emotion and the same movement as I can perform with my art. So I missed that element of brush in it, even if it's not giving that detailed brush focus mark on the paper. So I needed something different than maybe brush, cloth, paper wrap, cardboard. And the mop became that natural tool just because it's almost like an oversized brush, but with just a little bit of different texture in it. And allows me to have that extend element of the stick that allows full movement of the body and then freedom of just splashing that ink on the surface.
Do you think it was a good balance of control and non-control?
Yes, it was a good balance of both control and not control. For two instances. One, it gave me that freedom of not thinking about what I'm going to do after it. And then on the other hand, I also had that element of control as well. I did a portrait of someone, and for that portrait, I had to specifically focus or premeditate the mop mark before I actually move it back to the wall, because the purpose of it was different. The purpose was to make a portrait that really represents that person, not just the mark making and brush strokes, that I can explore into something that will reside the face.
Did you know who you wanted to paint on each canvas? Like,
yes.
Before you started?
So I decided to stick to maybe there were like 2-3 maximum images that I explore over and over in the same manner and places. So maybe I just flip them horizontally. I flip them horizontally so they can just either look at each other or things like that. So that mark I already had, I had to just combine those elements of the face and incorporate that into the mark making. So they have some similarities, but at the same time, they don't follow the same pattern of the face. So please feel free to explore the space on the back. You can ask me more questions if you have some. There is also a video played at the back, and the older voice of that video is from the podcast that Al did with me, and you can also listen to the podcast online if you want, where I talk about completely different aspect of my art practice than I said here today. Thank you.